at you with another video. It's been a couple of weeks or 3 weeks or so since I did one of these, but I saw a video last night. I can't remember the poster's name, the creator of the video's name. I should credit him. But anyway, I saw a video last night about grounding your fantasy, and it used Lord of the Rings as an example. And it spawned me, because I've been wanting to do another video, it sort of spurred me into doing this one, which is based on grounding your fantasy, which I think was in the title of the video. If I can find it, I'll post it down below. Anyway, so today is about grounding your fantasy, and I'm GM Mikey, or Mike Yao, with Savage Kingdoms, a role-playing game that some of you are familiar with. So I'm a game designer, just on the side, kind of a dabbling game designer and an actor. And so this is where a lot of this experience is coming from. I've been gaming since about 1979, which is a really long time. But anyway, so hopefully I have a lot of or at least some insight I can give you guys. So I want to talk about grounding your fantasy, right? What this means is, it almost sounds like it's a contradiction in terms, but it's not. So fantasy, of course, is the fantastical, is dreamlike. In particular, medieval fantasy seems to be probably the main genre and my favorite genre. So to ground one's fantasy, and I've got several little bullet points to talk about, grounding one's fantasy would be a good example that the video used was Lord of the Rings. Now, the Lord of the Rings, of course, was by J.R.R. Tolkien. Very famous, has basically spawned the whole subgenre of high fantasy. And I would say it's grounded because one reason that people cite for it being grounded is Gandalf doesn't use a lot of overt sorceries or magics. He uses very little magical effects. Now, those of you familiar with the lore of behind Middle Earth, that's because he's not really allowed to. When he left Valinor to travel to Middle Earth in the form of Gandalf the Grey, or Mithrandir, he was told by the Valar, the greater gods, and I believe by Iluvatar Eru himself, which of course means God, that he was not allowed to directly dabble into mortal affairs. Now, he actually straddled that oath a little bit, because he actually probably did a little more than he should, but he was in great love of particularly the hobbits and men, who he was mostly in charge with. The other two blue wizards went to the south, I think, as most of us know. The brown wizard Radagast sort of got stuck in Mirkwood, or Greenwood as it was called before it got tainted. Who else are we missing? The white wizard, yeah, Saruman, or not. So Saruman sort of got stuck and corrupted with his whole thing. So anyway, we know the story there. But so none of them were allowed to overtly use their magical powers. Wizards, they were called, but actually Istari is the real name for them. And just men, people just called them wizards because they didn't really know what their actual deal was. So anyway, so they were grounded. The whole story's pretty grounded. There obviously is some high fantasy elements, of course, which make it very interesting. Mordor and Sauron and the ring race can get pretty high fantasy-ish, which is great, makes great storytelling. But if you really read The Lord of the Rings and the way the movies were done, particularly Peter Jackson's movies, it does remain grounded. And the video goes on to say the one reason that Peter Jackson had grounded the story so well, which was a success, was that it was a fairly limited budget for the time. For doing 3 movies at once, New Line Cinemas was really taking a chance on Peter Jackson and his creative team to get these movies done, not only relatively cheaply, but also successfully, so that the studio could make some money off of it. And the fact that they were limited actually made the movies perhaps even better than they probably would have been if they had extra money to do all these fantastical CGI effects. And some CGI, particularly nowadays, is pretty good. I mean, a lot of it's pretty good, but it's the use of it. It's just because you have a bunch of tools and all these limitless resources at your hands doesn't mean that you need to necessarily use them all. So you need to focus your energy, and I'll get to that in a second about creative limitations. So the fact that he was limited somewhat on budget constraints, and Peter Jackson has quoted himself is known for his quote about how The Lord of the Rings was like the largest low budget set of films in history. And what he's saying is that they used a lot of techniques that were old school and sort of low budget, forced perspective tricks like that. A lot of stage tricks where props were practical, and they were puppets, or they were stuffed mannequins that did things and jostled on horses, and so it was a very old style of filmmaking, but enhanced by some of this computer graphic interface technology that they could use. So overall, the effect was that it was grounded, just like the books. Not a lot of things are super ridiculously fantastic. Tolkien spends a lot of time crafting the world to make it feel like it's real. And so many people say when they read Lord of the Rings, and I think there was this weird little study that came out where 35% of college kids or some control group thought that Helm's Deep was a historical event. And that just shows that Tolkien's writing was so precise and so realistic or believable or grounded that a lot of people believed some of those events were true, because he just crafted the world so well. Now, granted, Middle-earth was our world way back when, the middle world between the two, between Valinor and sort of the lower realms. So that's kind of where Middle-earth comes from. It also comes from the term Midgard from the Norse mythologies. But anyway, so that's what grounding your fantasy in a nutshell. Lord of the Rings is a good example of that. Just real quick, the guy in the video went on to say that, which I happen to be wearing today, this is actually coincidental, the Hobbit t-shirt. So he said The Hobbit wasn't quite as successful, and I think 98% of us would agree, as Lord of the Rings, because it was just stretched a little bit. It was sort of bombastic for no real reason to be, other than it had a 3 times larger budget, I believe. So again, more resources, and then maybe perhaps they felt like they just had to use all these resources, which, I understand, but so there's a lot more, whereas the Lord of the Rings, I believe, Fellowship of the Ring had 550 special effects shots, computer graphic shots in particular, and The Hobbit had something like 3,000. So it makes the movie a little bit jumbled of a mess. There's a lot of sort of video gamey, over the top sort of high fantasy stuff going on where it wasn't really necessary. Hitchcock was a master of showing what wasn't there, so it was left to your imagination, the crazy horrors and the super psychological, supernatural horrors that were going on in people's minds. So sometimes not showing something on the screen or not particularly describing something in detail leaves a hole in your viewers or readers' imagination, and they fill it in with all sorts of probably something worse than you could have shown or written in the first place. But it's getting up to that. The story part of it is crafting it to getting to that point to where someone is like, makes the conclusion of, oh my God, it could be this or that, or something really horrible or really awesome, whatever it is, whatever mood you're trying to convey. Right, so number 2 about grounding your fantasy is creative limitations, which I just briefly spoke of. So that is purposely limiting yourself, or perhaps not even purposely. Perhaps you really do not have the resources to create the movie, the film that you want, or the book that you want, or the game that you want. I use a lot of this philosophy, and which is why I wanted to do this with the Savage Kingdoms role-playing game. And I know a lot of game designers and writers do as well. Perhaps they're not aware that they're doing it, but I think subconsciously a lot of us do it. But sometimes maybe we don't think about it, and maybe this will be helpful. But that's like not going over the top, even if you can. Writing a simple sentence doesn't mean that you're not capable of writing a complex sentence. And I suffer through this myself, trust me, a lot, where I have to be flowery and I can just write the basic thing. Now, on the other hand, you have to balance that because you want to be entertaining and engaging, and you want to use words that pull people in. So you have to find that balance. And this is probably what creative limitations, and you can probably tell in that very phrase, creative limitations, that it's all there in balance. You want to be creative. Creative means, to open yourself up and to whatever and create things. Limitations is the balancing factor to that two-word sentence. Limiting yourself, either because you have to, or even if you're not limited, even if you really do have all sorts of resources to pull from, it doesn't mean you necessarily need to do that. So part of that is purposely limiting yourself to fewer choices. A good example of that was Lord of the Rings. Like I said, Peter Jackson didn't quite have the budget as many modern movies or films would, so he was limited purposely there. But sometimes I think in game design, particularly, we need to limit ourselves, or world building, we need to limit ourselves. So with Savage Kingdoms and Lord of the Rings, Robert E. Howard, another favorite of mine, limited his stuff to he was pretty young. He was from Texas. And he wrote most of the Conan stories from the ages of 18 to 22. Now he's known for Solomon Kane and Kull and a bunch of other characters as well, Cormac McArt. But Conan definitely is the one people know. And as good as those stories were, he was only 18 to 22 years old with a medium education at best, living in the Badlands of Texas. Managed to craft these incredible stories that are with us today that have inspired an entire genre of fantasy known as sword and sorcery. So now he was limited himself somewhat by education. Now he was super creative, super probably genius or borderline genius. I don't know if anybody has any actual stats on his IQ or whatever, but in any case, he was super creative. So he broke beyond his limitations of education and world and life experience and world experience just through imagination. He had some books to pull from the local library. Bullfinch's Mythology is the one that was like famously laying on his desk all the time next to his old typewriter that he pulled from. So, but that was about it, other than his imagination, in order to craft this world called the Hyborian Age, or Hyboria as people call it, although that's technically not true. That only actually talks about part of the world. Anyway, so the Hyborian Age that he wrote the Conan stories from, which took place roughly 10,000 BC. So he was limited by that, but he probably, hopefully, even at a young age, purposely limited himself. So if you read those books, or if you play any of the Conan role-playing games that have come out, you'll see that the world is very based, it's very grounded in reality, because it was our world 10,000 BC, 10,000 years ago, right before the Ice Age. And so that's what makes it so real. Conan seems like a real person. He seems like he meets. I mean, he does fantastical feats of strength and stuff, but they're never ridiculously over the top. Like you could see a very athletic, very strong man connected to nature, living in a sort of a wild, Celtic-ish, tribal, clan-based society. Someone could do that if they were in super great shape and are really good into with nature. He never jumps a mile to another building, or he never strangles. Oh, never mind. He does strangle a giant snake with his bare hands, but he doesn't do anything that's ridiculously over the top. And in fact, people make reference that Conan could defeat anything and he's not afraid of anything. Completely untrue. If you really read the original sagas, he never runs from a man. He never runs from creatures of flesh and blood. He takes on armies. He's cut swaths through king's guardsmen trying to arrest him. But if you notice, whenever it's a demonic thing or something that he doesn't understand, he almost always flees. He almost always gets out of there. And that's why he lives to become king of Aquilonia, later on at age 45 or whatever. So he lives through all these ridiculous adventures because he is actually very, very smart, very clever. So anyway, without getting too much on a tangent of that, so Robert E. Howard purposely and unpurposely, because of his physical limitations and mental limitations, or I should say environmental limitations, was limiting his craft there. So he was because of limitations, he produced something that was very grounded. So when you're creating your fantasy adventures, or if you are a game designer or want to design a game, or if you're a screen writer or a playwright, allow those limitations to happen if you're trying to create something grounded. If you're going for something completely high fantasy and completely fantastical, then obviously you need to sort of reach. But remember the drawback to that, which I'll get to in just a second on point number 3. There is a drawback to that as well. So let's just go on to point number 3. So point number 3 is what I call magical versus mundane, or the magical versus the mundane, or the mystical versus the normal. When one becomes the other. So grounding fantasy, because again it is fantasy. If you want supernatural elements, you want magic, you want spells, you want sorcery or whatever. You obviously you're going to craft rules for that, or you're going to describe those effects when they happen in your book, or if you're game mastering a role-playing game. So, but the trick is you have to balance that with the mundane. If everything is so magical, and people who know me know this is a fairly passionate point of mine, if everyone could cast spells and everyone can fly and everyone can live to be 1,000 years old, then nothing is mundane anymore. So therefore the magical becomes the mundane. It becomes the norm. So to make it pop, to make it really magical, look up the actual definition, Webster's definition of magical. I believe it used to be the number one was, I'm paraphrasing here, but what is it? Anything that can't be explained by science. And then it says like, i.e., that is not mundane. Anyway, I just totally butchered that. I tried to paraphrase it and I still butchered it. Anyway, the point being is that Webster is saying anything that's rare and fantastical, I think is the verbiage, i.e. not mundane. So again, if everything is crazy, everyone's flying on fly carpets all over the place, it's not grounded. And honestly, your readers and your players they might think it's really cool for an hour or two, and they're going to get 98% chance they're going to get really bogged down and confused about what's going on. And it'll be very cartoony. Now, if you're running a cartoon-like game and everyone is in on it and they're aware that that's the genre, that's what's going to be happening, then it's fine, or at least it's fine-ish, because everyone's on board with what's going on. But if you really want people, particularly adult players, like, smaller young kids, like the more fantastical, their brains are expanding, their imagination's crazy. I teach kids after school. I teach RPG camp, and I see it firsthand. Their imaginations are sparked, just like we were when we were 13, 14 years old, 12 years old, which is great. But as they get older, and even some of the more mature kids around 13 or 14 or whatever, 15, they're going to want to start reaching for something that's a little more grounded, because they're becoming more aware of their own world, how the world works. And if you know how the world works, that's your basis for your grounding, for your reality, and then you can add your fantastical effects on top of that. So that's why my firm belief is that low to medium magic settings, and this is personal choice, work the best. This is why I personally prefer low to medium magic or high mysticism settings the best, because reality is there. There's a mountain range that's like ours in real life. There's a sun. Some of it may be slightly different. Like in the Savage Kingdom setting, the sun is a red giant in scientific terms. It's a big red sun, meaning that it's big, but it's not going to last as long as our real life sun, which is a yellow sun. It's closer to burning out, but it's huge, so it applies enough light for the world. It has 2 moons instead of 1, so that's not too crazy. It's just enough to be fantastical and different enough. Although 2 moons has its own problem, because you have to come up with the moon cycles and all this crazy stuff. So just be aware that if you do that, you will have to create some reality about that. So you'll have to create some. You can do some research on how 2 moons would work and what their phases would be as it circulates the globe, or you can come up with your own fantasy reason for it. But the point is, even with fantasy, you have to create a reality. If you don't want to use the physical laws of our real world, that's great, although I recommend that you do in 95% of cases. But you have to come up with your own set of physical laws. So it's one thing to say that, well, that just works. Then, like, it works, but here's how it works, or here's how people in the world believe that it works. So generally, you know, have a way to explain why magical spells work, or at least a belief that they work. I kind of go in between the Savage Kingdoms. I don't like to make it science because science to me kind of gets in the way of fantasy sometimes. But there needs to be a physical law of how things in general work. So the magic system in Savage Kingdoms is used as an example, and I think Tolkien does this in Lord of the Rings as well, and a lot of writers and game designers do, is that you explain in general how it works, or even like how scholars and the greatest magicians believe how it works, but then leave it open how it truly, what the truth actually is. So, for example, you speak this spell formula, or you trace these runes in the air and speak these words of power, and this effect happens. And you believe that you studied it from a scroll written in the old language of Ebenezu, or the old language of Ar, or the old Shi tongue. And by speaking this ancient mystical language and performing this exact incantation, the spell takes effect. But beyond that, you probably don't really know. Some people believe, well, it's the gods hear me and allow the effect to work. Maybe a zealous priest believes that. In a game system like Dungeons and Dragons, it's more clear cut. It's the clerics or priests believe that their powers come from the gods, and the way the mechanics are set up, they kind of do. I mean, you can make the setting be where you're not quite sure, but the mechanics really are sort of tied to that. Whereas a sorcerer or a wizard or a warlock believes it's more of an arcane thing, that it's spells they stole from the church or from a temple, or they don't believe that the magic that they're calling forth is coming from the divine. Although, again, perhaps it does. So that's the leaving it open part towards the end. So just leave the entire thing open. If you explain the entire, I speak the spell incantation because it comes from the god so and so at noon every day when he's not sleeping or feasting in his great hall in the other world. That's precisely how it works. You could do that if you want, but that sounded kind of boring. Maybe it sounded a little silly and funny, but it's kind of boring because then it becomes a science and not a fantastical sort of scholarly lore-like assumption. So magical versus the mundane. So unless you're creating super high fantasy, you want to ground it. Trust me, it will be so much more realistic. It will do something that we use in the acting world, in writing world. You hear the term resonance. Resonance a lot. It means, does it resonate? Meaning, does it resonate between you and also your reader or viewer? Something that resonates. So things that have resonance are things that are grounded, things that you can latch on to your perception and your life experience. For example, if I'm playing a character, someone's reading a book, and the GM is describing, or the reader or the writer has written that I'm traveling through a mountain range covered with snow-top peaks, and he probably goes in a little more detail. But just that alone, I now know from real-world experience. I've seen pictures of mountains. I myself live in mountains, although they're a little bit lower. They're not as massive as, say, the Rockies or the Himalayas. But still, I have enough life experience to have either traveled through mountains with snow on them or have seen plenty of pictures that I know that's in my memory. So if you take a super fantastical, non-grounded approach and you say you're traveling through an area where the mountains are completely upside down, they're floating in the sky, and then in place of the ground where they would be, there's a giant chasm that's 7 miles deep, and there looks like there might be lava at the bottom. Well, that's kind of cool and sort of fantastical and kind of eerie, like a weird bad dream, but it's hard to resonate. It's hard to connect with it because you've never in real life seen massive floating mountains with a 7-mile gorge. You probably don't know what 7 miles downward looks like, let alone try and imagine what that would be with lava at the bottom or whatever it was that I said. So maybe the in-between could be that you could describe, if you want to get kind of fantastical, giant mountains you're traveling through with snow at the top, except for at the very top of one of them, you see a red glow, and some of the snow is glowing down. Now, that's sort of fantastical because maybe that describes a volcano, but that's also not unrealistic. There are places in our real world where that happens or could happen, particularly Iceland and lots of other places, I'm sure. The land of fire and ice is what they call it for a reason. So try to keep your descriptions and your world building grounded. Another trick to that is like what I try to do is 95% of my geographical features are real or should happen in the real world or could happen. Rivers flow more towards the equator. Mountains are typically no higher than 5, 6, 7 miles. Most of them are a lot less than that. The deepest part of the ocean is probably no more than 7 or 8 miles deep. Maybe the world is filled with 70% water, but it could be 90% water or 50% water, and that wouldn't be too stretching physical laws. So, but then, say that's 95% of it. Say the other 5 to 10%, maybe there are a few places in your world that defy the laws of real world physics. So again, that would be that would be the magical part of it. So everything else is sort of grounded, and maybe they come to this weird place. For example, in the Savage Kingdom setting, the Shadowlands or the Forbidden Lands, or a little ramped up. The Forbidden Lands are I will totally admit, very much like Mordor. It's ringed by mountains. There's a lot of ash. There's a lot of differences other than that, but just in general, it's very Mordorian. The Shadowlands are a blighted forest with twisted trees. There's a place in Malovia called the Wraithwood where the trees are twisted and gnarled, and people don't like to cross through them. And there actually are wood wraiths. They're like undead wraiths or spirits attached to the trees. And then there are other places where there's I'm trying to think. There's a place in Zarkon, the Purple River. Called that because the water is just so purple. It's polluted by this from 2,000 years ago, this huge war of wizardry, the war of light and shadow that was fought between the Aryans and the Zarkonians, or the people of Zarkon. And there's a black river generally in the same area, and that's actually from so much black lotus grows along the shores that it just kind of drips and oozes into the river, and it's like the water is almost completely black. So there are ways to get completely fantastical without being ridiculous. But see, even those are grounded because they are rivers. So at least in people's minds, when you describe a purple or black river, at least they know, okay, river, it's probably flowing, it's probably moving to some direction, probably to an ocean, maybe not, maybe into a lake or something. But now my imagination has to put the purple or black layer on top of that. And that's fine. So you've grounded it in a river, and that's great. Same with the Forbidden Lands or Mordor. It's like ash. It's barren. It's dry, surrounded by a ring of mountains. But again, there are ashy deserts in the real world, and there are mountains. So we can attach our minds to that. We can resonate with that. All right. So that's magical versus the mundane. When one becomes and there's just real quick on the flip side of that, if things are too mundane, like there's nothing fantastical in the world. Then it's really there's nothing magical anymore. And usually that's not the issue at all. The issue is usually things being so over the top that that you can't resonate or attach to it. But be aware, there is a flip side of that. If you want your setting to be supernatural and magical, that you need to ground it, like I said, but you don't want to, if you completely ground it, 99%, 100% ground it, then it's not fantasy anymore. So be aware of that. There is a flip side of that. So point number 4, interesting and engaging characters, not over the top. So this is kind of ties in with point number 3, magical versus mundane. So you want, using that same sort of thinking, you want characters that you create, non-player characters, player characters, or if you're writing a novel or a screenplay or a play, you want your characters to be grounded as well and not completely over the top. So it's cool to have one character that jumps really far, is really acrobatic, or knows how to cast a couple of really interesting spells that maybe hardly anyone else in the setting knows, or perhaps even rides a giant lizard. I could probably handle that. But you don't want to do, okay, this character rides a giant lizard. He has 3 eyes. He's got purple hair. He carries a spear that bursts into flame 1 hour per day, and then every other hour it bursts into ice. So just, that's a little over the top, but that's my point. If you have a character that's got all of that going on, it's really hard to resonate. It's really hard to connect to with your imagination what's going on there. It works better in like anime or something like that. But even if you watch most anime, and I'll admit I'm not a massive anime fan, even that's somewhat grounded. You're probably not going to find a character that I just described. Maybe in some of them, and that's fine. That's a visual thing. You can literally look at the screen and see the what I just described drawn out in an image, and it's a little easier to connect to. But if you're trying to describe it or read it, it's really difficult. So try to ground your characters, not only physically, but also ground them with personality. Give them real goals, real motivations, real personality traits. I know as an actor, I try to grab hold when I'm cast to play a character. I try to one acting exercise, like it is an old thing, is like to find three things that you connect with and try to bring them forth. I don't necessarily use the three things thing. I mean, sometimes it's five things or a dozen things. Sometimes it's two things. Um, but the point is, you want to find a few things that pop and try to drive them home just enough for the audience to connect with. So, for example, that character example I just gave you, perhaps instead of riding a giant lizard, he just simply rides a horse. You could even go more detailed. It's a black horse, solid black, from a line of noble horses that were bred from King what's his face all the way down to Prince what's his face. Or maybe it's an exceptionally large horse, or maybe it's a small withered horse. It's really old, or it's got a disease or something, or maybe it's a red horse or a pure white horse or something. So maybe that's what he's riding instead, or a camel or something. It could be even baby mammoth. That's not completely over the top. And then instead of purple hair, he just has normal hair that's long or braided in an unusual way, or maybe it's shaved on one side and there's a cool tattoo. And maybe instead of a spear that bursts in the fire, it's a spear that he dips in oil and lights it purposely before battle. So maybe it's not even really a magical spear at all. He's using more alchemy or survival, real world sort of stuff. So there are ways to do that to make that character a little more grounded. So, and like I said, the personality traits. So the personality traits, instead of say a character being motivated to kill all things that use magic, all wizards and sorcerers in the world, that's really kind of over the top, and that might be in a role-playing game, that might be very conflicty with a person or two you're traveling in the party. And intra-party conflict is fine, and maybe I'll do a video on that, but it has to not detract, or what we say on stage, not pull focus from the real thing. It can sort of yank focus for a moment, but it needs to bounce back to the main thing. Remember, a role-playing game is about everyone. Everyone's involved. It's a collective thing. It's a collective improvisational performance or exercise, really. Everybody feeds on each other, helps each other out, shines the spotlight. There could be some conflict because that's fun, because that creates story you build upon, especially with mature players that are maybe have a little more experience with either acting or with role playing. So that could be fine, but don't let that be the focus, unless you want that to be focus, unless you've discussed in your session 0 that maybe we're going to explore these themes of like going at each other and wanting up each other, something like that. But yeah, don't pull focus from the story with your like over the top shenanigans. So maybe instead of like my character loathes all magic, be my character loathes magicians from this particular order that he's heard of, preferably one that's like in the history of the world that's like antagonized his people or something. Like I said in a former video, if you use the game master or the author's own creation, like you're paying homage and respect to his or her world, that's awesome, because not only are you helping to build upon the story, improv technique, but you'll probably get maybe some little bonus points thrown your way, because the GM or the author is like, thanks for remembering my stuff, my creation, and not pushing back on it. Not that you can't add your own things, of course, but honoring the game master or author's stuff is usually a good idea. All right, so we're at like 34 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up here with the last thing. So the last thing is realistic descriptions based on the real world, and not using modern terminology. at all or much. And so this piggybacks on the other. So as you can tell, the 5 little things I've listed kind of piggyback on the other, but they're sort of their own thing. That's why I kind of broke them out. So number 5, realistic descriptions based on the real world. So that kind of covers some things that I just said. But since this is its own thing, it means that when you're describing, when you're writing as an author, or you're describing as a game master, what the characters are going through or what the readers are experiencing. If it's a fantasy setting, particularly one that's grounded, because that's what this video is about, you want to use real world. You want to use grounded descriptions, but avoid real world terminology. So this is where it gets a little different. So even though you want something grounded and more realistic or believable, that's great. But I personally would avoid using modern terminology very rarely, if at all. And this is mostly for mood. So for example, if someone is investigating an ancient chamber in a tomb, they've discovered a chamber, they've managed to break open the sealed door, perhaps pick the ancient lock on it, or dispel the warding spells that were on it, and someone sneaks into the room and he's investigating, he's sort of searching it out, his eyes peering into the dark, and there's a layer of dust and it's very musty. And the game master describes the mustiness and the darkness of it all. So the game master should, in my opinion, if it were me, I would be giving descriptive words, mostly what I just used, but I would avoid things like, it smells like your refrigerator that you haven't cleaned out in a month. So though that's a good shorthand to go, oh, that's probably kind of stinky and musty, and it also gives you the idea of being enclosed and maybe cold. So that's, in that way, that's a good choice. But in another way, it kind of takes people out of the mode, because now they're now thinking of a modern day refrigerator instead of an ancient tomb. Although again, that's a good shortcut to do it. So I would do it very limitedly. I think I occasionally do it. Sometimes I'll do it just to break the moment, like if it's a tense moment, just to kind of get a cheap laugh. I fully admit, I might say, yeah, it smells like 3-day-old underwear or something. Aha, funny. But do that sparingly, especially if it's a pretty serious game and you want the mood. So just literally describe it the way, without using any modernisms. And you can even put it into the era. Like it smells like an ancient tomb, particularly if this character is a tomb robber type character. You could say it smells, it reminds you of that one from a couple of years ago down in Ebenezuk, that one that where King Azrakar was buried. It reminds you a little of that, but perhaps even mustier. So that way you can ground it again. Or you could describe it as it smells like that the alchemy that you were trying to work on several months ago, that alchemical fire that you were trying to craft. It reminds you of that. Or the heat is so great in here that it reminds you of that volcano that exploded a dozen years ago before you left your tribe, or something like that. Or you could even say, it's as hot as you imagine the red sun to be in the sky above you, or as hot as the gods of fire would have it be, or as hot as the hell world or the netherworld, something like that, to kind of reconnect it to the world. So yeah, so basically, long story short on that, yeah, be descriptive. Obviously, you want to be descriptive because you are the one supplying the information to the imagination of your players and readers. They will build on it, what you give them, of course. So don't overdo it, but don't underdo it. So just use the proper amount of descriptions. Keep it grounded if you can, and don't use a lot of modern terminology because it will pull people out. So. All right, so thanks for putting up with this 38-minute video. Hopefully it was helpful. So this was about grounding your fantasy. So try some of these techniques if you haven't thought about them. I know most of you probably are familiar with this stuff already, but hopefully there's a few little things that you can use to ground your fantasy, make it more believable, and ultimately more enjoyable. All right, guys, this is Mike, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Thanks so much.